Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I am John Kelly, Senior Editor of The Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at @theimprintnews. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at Safe Camp Audio on social media. So on today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Jenny Tanis of the Hope College School of Social Work and Dr. Sacha Klein of the Michigan State University School of Social Work to talk about their research into the impact of state paid family leave policies on infant maltreatment. So the United States is among the few developed countries without any sort of national policy around paid family leave, but there is a growing number of states that have seen their legislatures and governors moving towards these types of policies. 4 states have had policies in place for a long time, and those are California, New Jersey, New York, and Rhode Island. And Drs. Tanis and Klein wanted to see what, if any, impact these policies have had on infant maltreatment in those states compared to trends in other states. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Jenny Tanis and Sacha Klein. Enjoy. We are joined today by Dr. Jenny Tanis of the Hope College School of Social Work and Dr. Sacha Klein of the Michigan State University School of Social Work. 3 Michiganders on one conversation today, talking about their research around paid family leave and child maltreatment. Dr. Tanis, Dr. Klein, thank you guys for joining us today on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks for having us.
So before we get into the weighty issues that you propose to look at in your research, let's let these guys get to know you a little bit. You gotta give me one favorite. You can give me more than that if you like. The categories are TV show and movie, sports team, musical group, or book. Dr. Klein, let's go with you first. What do you got for people?
Well, I would say that my favorite movie of all time, the one I have watched and rewatched the most often, is Aliens with Sigourney Weaver. I know this is going to destroy all my street cred as an academic, but I think it makes a certain amount of sense because it's, it was one of the first female action heroes out there in a blockbuster movie. And the second one, which is my favorite, has a very spunky, resilient child who has survived horrific circumstances and is leading the rest to safety. So
what a pro. She took her pop culture reference and then lashed it back to the actual topic. That is a pro move. Aliens definitely is one of the in the world of possible where the sequel's better than the original. It's got to be in the top 5.
Absolutely.
I agree with that. All right, Dr. Tanis, what do you got for us?
Book? I'm going to go the music route.
Okay, music route.
My Spotify account is no longer mine. My almost 6-year-old rules everything that we listen to. And he is very into rock and roll these days. So we listen to a lot of AC/DC and a lot of Queen, which is totally outside of my normal listening wheelhouse. But that is what fills our airwaves these days.
Oh, that's so much better than Baby Shark.
Oh, 100%. I will take TNT any day.
I just need to know how your 6-year-old came onto those bands, especially if it's not what you like.
Such a good question that I don't know that I have an answer for. I'm going to blame my husband, probably. I'm guessing it came up in a Beatles rotation, and all of a sudden here we are.
Yeah. And listeners may be treated to the dulcet sounds of a barking dog behind us. That is a foster named Paprika. Usually if you hear a dog on this, it's Gordy, my dog, but we got a foster in here. She's doing good. She's a little nervous sometimes. So let's start here by not assuming that listeners know everything there is to know about the social safety net and all of the myriad benefits that are out there. Explain what paid family leave is conceptually.
So paid family leave is a program that guarantees that somebody in the workforce can take time off from work There's different versions of it, certainly to care for a newborn or a baby in the iterations that we see mostly in states in the United States. That also includes being able to take time off to care for other family members as well. So including aging parents, et cetera. We have right now at the national level in the United States is what people call FMLA, and that is a guaranteed right to take the time off, but it doesn't guarantee that you will receive any of your paycheck if you do that. And so the reality is that the vast majority of Americans really can't afford to do that for any length of time.
Yeah. So FMLA, just so I try to get through the acronym, Family Medical Leave Act, right? That's what FMLA means. You can't get fired for it. You can leave for a period of time to deal with something, but that doesn't mean you're going to get paid for that time. Paid family leave is you can leave and you will be compensated. And what's it usually around 3 months?
It really varies state to state, but it's, usually somewhere in the ballpark of 60 to 90% of your salary, somewhere around there. And I think it's important to understand that this idea of paid family leave is something that is uniform, well, close to uniform across this world. So the United States is, depending on how you count, the United States is one of only 5 countries in the entire world that does not provide federal compensation guarantee for maternity leave. I believe the other 4 are like the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Papua New Guinea, et cetera.
Come on, Micronesia.
I know. Come on, get with the program here.
How does the financing work for it? I think people would think of like, oh, it's a federal program, so this is taxpayers are paying for it that way. How does paid family leave, which, as you're saying here, only exists on a state level now in the United States, like how does that work from a funding mechanism?
So again, it varies because it's state policy, right?
Sure.
But I can tell you, for instance, in Michigan, which is obviously where we are, and what's being considered here is a payroll tax. So something very similar to what we see for Medicare or for Social Security, where the employer is paying Social Security tax and then has the option of passing on 50% of that cost to the employee, which you can imagine most employers are probably going to want to do. So it's a mixture coming both from employee and employer. What were you going to add, Jenny?
I was just going to say, for the states that currently have paid family leave for infant care or like newborn care, most of the states are set up as a payroll tax for that type of family leave. It varies for like medical illness of the employee or of another family member, but most of those like bonding claims, as they're often called, are set up as a payroll tax structure for the current state described Michigan proposing.
Right. So it would be fair for a listener to just view this as a very population level policy piece of a broader social safety net.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And, as Sacha was saying, there's no federal across the board mandate for this. So it's something that is done on a state to state basis. And, I guess the origin story of your guys' kind of research that we're going to talk about here is that there were, some early adopters in the United States that have had paid family leave in effect, for a long enough period of time where you guys were able to kind of look at it. What are those states? And like, maybe you could talk a little bit also about just like where we've gone since then, or how many states have kind of adopted in more recent years.
Sure. So the states that we looked at specifically were California, New Jersey, New York, and Rhode Island. California being the first adopter of a state level paid family leave policy. They passed their legislation in 2002 and implemented in 2004. New Jersey was the next state in 2009. So we're able to look at those 4 early states we'll get into the research a little bit later, I'm sure, but to look at kind of how maltreatment rates may change in the wake of policy change when we add a policy or a safety net like paid family leave to what families receive.
Got it. Okay, so those are the 4 core states, and then what's been the more recent action around paid family leave? Seems like there's been more interest, like in Michigan, for example.
Oh yeah, there's 14 states at this point, and Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico have all sort of taken the matter into their own hands since we weren't thus far able to pass a national policy. So, and then there are other states like Michigan where it has not been passed, but there are currently bills being considered by the state legislature that would create the program.
Gotcha. And before we get to kind of what you guys looked at as like a nexus point between paid family leave and social outcomes, maybe one of you could talk a little bit just about like what I'm sure that people have studied the impact of paid family leave on other things. Are there any that stand out to you, where we've clearly drawn a line between paid family leave as a policy and either good or negative, I'm assuming good outcomes?
Yeah, so the vast majority of the research on paid family leave in the United States, the early forms of it focused on labor participation and women in the workforce. So what does paid family leave do as far as retaining female workers, wages, things like that? But as we've seen more states adopt paid family leave, we've been looking at more maternal and child health outcomes. A lot of research around increased breastfeeding initiation and duration, mental health and physical health outcomes for mothers, some research on mental health for fathers, and then infant health outcomes. So there's some research around the presence of paid family leave, increasing infant vaccination rates, decreasing some common respiratory illnesses, and some other really important health outcomes as far as low birth weight, well-child visits, decreased low birth weight births, decreased premature births, things like that we can attribute to more healthy long-term outcomes for kiddos, but really focusing on those maternal and child health outcomes.
Okay, so early research kind of suggested, mostly from a labor perspective, improvements in job retention. And then we've moved towards seeing better health outcomes for both mom and child within the research. Okay. And then, so what you guys did, I guess, you're not the first in, right? Because there was a study in 2016, I think, that came out that really looked at the kind of connection between paid family leave and then just very serious physical abuse admissions to hospitals. Is that about right? Okay. Yeah. Right. Okay. Which found what?
Basically, so it focused specifically on California. So it was done early enough that really there was only data for California, good longitudinal data at that point. And it definitely established a link between hospital admission rates for abusive pediatric head trauma, which is essentially indicative of a very serious form of physical child abuse. But it was sort of the study. I mean, I got interested in this, I think, when Jenny shared that article describing that study with me. The researchers who did it are out of the CDC, which has increasingly become interested in particular in infant maltreatment, as seeing that as a serious public health problem. So part of our certainly my interest in the topic comes from really sort of a focus on very young children in the child welfare system, and as the sort of age cohort that is disproportionately represented in the United States child welfare system, and also the age group that is most at risk for some of the worst outcomes associated with maltreatment. So they're more likely to die. They're more likely to suffer from a serious injury as a result of maltreatment. So it really focused on the physical abuse piece, and it just focused on California in comparison to other states.
The word they used in their finding is, maybe you two can walk me through the strength of it. Because like sometimes you see research and it's like causal or associative. Theirs was California's paid family leave showed a significant decrease in the hospital administrations, which like I just remember reading and being like, that's like way up here policy and way down here. Like, I didn't know what showed meant there. Like, how did you guys take that as like closer to associated than causal, or what?
So I'll take a stab at this, and Jenny, you can.
Yeah, please.
Jenny's got more expertise in this, but at a really basic level, they use something called a difference in difference analysis design, which, with population level studies, you can't do the gold standard, right? Sure. You almost never could do a clinical trial, right? Because we don't randomize. If everybody in the state got the policy, then you can't sort of randomize, a group that got it and a group that didn't. Which
you'd actually have to withhold paid family leave from.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Right. That would give you in many ways, your strongest research design, but that isn't an option when you're looking at these kinds of policies. Right. So typically the best you're going to get is what we consider a quasi-experimental design, right? Where you're creating a comparison group sort of after the fact. And what a difference in difference study does is it essentially uses statistics to create that kind of comparison. So it's a much stronger design than just sort of your typical observational type of design that just sort of established, hey, there's a link here, but we don't really know what caused what, right? It's more, it has better controls than that kind of design. So I wouldn't, they're being good researchers and being very cautious in the language that they use, but it's a pretty good design given the realities they were working with.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's a great explanation of it.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. It's journalist Lisa Ling, and I'm sure you will agree that it is so important for there to be good, trustworthy journalism on children and families, and nobody does that better than The Imprint. I am such a devotee of The Imprint, and I listen to The Imprint Weekly podcast because it is so comprehensive and so substantive, and it is by far the best news source for anyone interested in critical issues like foster care, juvenile justice, youth homelessness, and so much more. During this holiday season of giving, I hope you'll consider donating to The Imprint. If you do so between now and the end of the year, your donation will be doubled thanks to the National Newsmatch campaign. To give is so easy. Go to imprintnews.org/donate. That's imprintnews.org/donate. Thank you so much.
Okay, so you guys went, basically a step further, I would say, in scope, because they looked at, the nexus between paid family leave and what I think most people would agree is like the most serious and indicator of serious trauma for kids, whether it's neglect or abuse, they're going to the hospital. But we know that, of course, that is a small subset of, people who would be investigated or suspected of experiencing it, right? So you went much bigger than that, and in several states, right? Why don't you explain kind of like how the methodology came about for this and sort of what the comparison was between states in the control and treatment, so to speak?
Yeah, well, I think one of the big conversations that we had is pretty along the lines of what we were just saying, is that pediatric abusive head trauma is this extremely severe form of physical abuse. And it's a really important finding that we find out this link between paid family leave and a reduction in this severe form of physical abuse. But if we look at child maltreatment statistics, we know that a vast majority of children in the child welfare system experience neglect. And so we were really curious if that effect held for other types of maltreatment. So how could we create a similar study looking at paid family leave and broadening the scope, like you said, to include other forms of maltreatment, and maybe bringing in some other states to make sure that this wasn't just a California specific finding.
So right. So by the time you guys did that, there were 3 more states where there was viable information. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the important thing too is if we're going to look at the effect of paid family leave, we need enough time after the policy was implemented to understand what maltreatment rates are looking like after policy implementation. So if you think about the study we were just talking about being published in 2016, at that time, there were 3 states with paid family leave, but Rhode Island's program had only been available for 2 years. In 2014, they implemented. So they had limited data to work with. And we had the opportunity to add a couple more states to see if this effect was non-specific to California. So looking at the 4 states we mentioned earlier and maltreatment investigation rates broadly, rather than just a specific subset of maltreatment.
So I'll let you go after this, Dr. Klein, but basically there's kind of 3 groups. There's the 4 states that had a long enough track record for you to look at. There's the states that have recently passed it or were in their path. And then there's the states that just have not done anything yet. And you compared the 4 to that other group, right? But basically.
The 4 that have not, we excluded any states that had passed paid family leave, but didn't have long enough data for us to include. So our control group was only states without a paid family leave policy.
I think it's important to understand the sort of the source of the data that we used for our outcome, because we used what's called NCANS data. We used basically administrative child welfare data regarding infants that were investigated for possible maltreatment. And part of my interest in doing that is that, as we alluded to earlier, this policy is not free to implement. There's a lot of pushback that happens around payroll taxes or taxes of any kind. And so I think it's really important to understand not only sort of the human effects of a policy, right? And certainly preventing the abuse of a baby is a really powerful and important outcome. But I think it is important for policymakers who are having to make these decisions about whether or not to implement the policies to also have a sense of the economic impact, right, of doing that. And this isn't a cost study, but we know that our child welfare system is very expensive, especially when kids enter it, at a very young age and then remain in it. And so using the NCANS data, for me, I think sort of sets the stage to start to have a discussion about, not only the labor force participation and the maternal child health participation, but what are the potential cost savings at the back end related to reduced child welfare system involvement.
And the metric you kind of honed in on was investigations, correct? I mean, there's all these different points along the line. You could look at when reports happen, which is, gives you the biggest population, but it includes a lot of junk's not the word I want to use, but it's a lot of things that will end up getting diverted out of the system or just kicked out. Investigations. And then I guess more acute would be to look at just substantiated infant maltreatment. So you chose investigations, or you're looking at me like that wasn't really possible, right?
No, it was possible actually, but I would take issue with the word acute, like the assumption that, and I think this is a really common perspective, right? That, somebody calls in, they report a suspected maltreatment. If they give the right kind of details, like an address, then it gets investigated. And then a caseworker decides, okay, is there some reasonable amount of evidence that meets a standard to think that this abuse or neglect really happened? And so it's easy to assume that then if it's substantiated, it's real, right? As opposed to spurious, or that it's more serious and it meets a threshold. And it can mean that for some cases, but the reason we went with investigations, there were a couple of reasons, but one of the main reasons is that when you're talking, and this is my experience of having been a child protective services worker back in the day, right? Is that when you're investigating maltreatment of an infant who is nonverbal, it's much harder to substantiate, right? So you're completely dependent on physical and medical evidence at that point. And, babies don't talk. They can't tell you what happened to them. So that's one of the reasons why we felt like we wanted to work with investigations rather than just substantiations. We felt like we would be likely to miss a lot of cases that way.
I see. Okay. And then the scope of kind of like what years you looked at, I was wondering if this was like a happy accident or what, but like you looked at 2002 through 2019, which could just kind of struck me as kind of good that it didn't slide into the super weird first season of COVID where we're still trying to figure out whatever happened with anything, right? It's just like, it's going to be an outlier. So did you guys do that intentionally and just cut it off? Like, could you have looked further and decided not to?
When we originally designed this, I think we only had up to 2019 data. And then as our project kind of continued, we could have added 2020, 2021, but made a conscious decision to keep our original data set because of a lot of the confounding variables that COVID would have added to the mix.
Okay, so we've talked about all the ways that you got here. Let's now turn to kind of what you've found. I think I want to turn it to you guys to kind of walk through this, but I'll say, like, I just remember the first time I read through in the order that you guys put the charts, the first thing I saw was what the infant maltreatment investigation patterns were just in the 4 states. And looking at that, I was like, oh, I mean, they just all kind of went up for the most part. I mean, there was some downtailing at the end, but then you get to that comparison between the experience of those states and the control group, and it really is a wow kind of visual. So when you take people through that wow visual and kind of what you guys found.
Yeah, well, I think that, like, I love hearing your reaction to that, because I think that is the impactful piece of this data is like the policy itself may not be decreasing infant maltreatment on its face, right? But when we compare states with paid family leave to states without paid family leave, we're seeing that infant maltreatment rates slow down after policy implementation for states with the policy in comparison to states without. And that each year after policy implementation, our rate of increase decreased. Now that sounds really confusing, but like that rising rate that you saw in those first charts became less steep, but it was rising at a slower rate than states without paid family leave.
Yeah, the increase is far less steep. So like what you're seeing, and you see this in a lot of the prevention research, right? And it's why it's so important to have some sort of comparison group, because if the overarching trend across the country is that infant maltreatment is on the rise, and that is the overarching trend, and that has been the trend for some time, and that's what we are concerned with. It's not just about, can you like change that sort of trend so that now it starts to decrease? That would be fabulous. We would love to be able to do that. But even if you can get it to level off in some ways, that's still incredibly meaningful in terms of the effect of a policy or a program.
You know what was like weirdly what I thought of as like an analogy in another space, and not to get into just a very obviously politically thorny thing here. Let's set the politics aside from it. But
Go for it.
Obviously over the last 2 years or whatever, since like the worst of COVID, we experienced inflation in this country. Whenever it went up a lot, it really hurt people at the checkout counter, gas, all that stuff. So you look at that and it's like, oh, that stinks. If you look at it in the context of a lot of other countries, there was like insane inflation that makes ours look not so good. So I guess the word, like the common theme, I guess, would be like the word blunted. Is it fair to say that your research suggests that paid family leave may blunt what would be an otherwise, sharp increase in infant maltreatment?
Yeah, I think that's an accurate description.
You guys started working off of the hospital admissions study. What comes after yours? I mean, most research just yields the next question. So like, what would you guys want to do or want somebody else to do to kind of go a step further here? How do we move it forward? Or do you think that this is kind of the level it's going to be at?
Jenny's actually done some research since we did this study. So, which I would love, Jenny, for you to sort of share about what you found, and then we could talk about, future work.
Go for it.
So I think one of the glaring questions for me after we were able to wrap this study up was, okay, great. We were able to confirm that this protective factor, or this blunting, and to use your language, held for all maltreatment types. But we still don't have much insight into neglect specifically, which I was really curious about, knowing that nearly 75% of all maltreatment cases are neglect related. And when you think about the economic factors and the relation of poverty to neglect, what is going on with neglect specifically? So I was able to do some research looking at a similar design to the pediatric abusive head trauma. I used difference in difference, but looking at the effect of paid family leave on maltreatment types. I looked at physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and emotional abuse, and found that paid family leave was protective against neglect. So that's really exciting, and that hopefully this publication will be forthcoming, that people will be able to have access to. And then to tease that out even further, looking kind of at some parental characteristics of when is paid family leave protective for substantiated cases of neglect. And I was able to find, I'm not going to get too much into the weeds of design, but some interesting findings of neglect being protective for white caregivers, female caregivers, and male caregivers who are perpetrators of neglect. So in states, to kind of explain that a little bit more concisely, in states with paid family leave, when there is a substantiated case of infant neglect, states with higher percentages of female perpetrators, male perpetrators, and white perpetrators experience a decrease in rates of neglect, or that blunted effect. But the interesting piece of that, I think for me, to come out of that research is this equity piece of how are we designing paid family leave policies, because the finding of it not being protective for non-white caregivers was curious to me. Why are all other caregivers experiencing this benefit from paid family leave policies. And I'm really curious, and this kind of will go into future research. We might need some better data to really dig into some of these more nuanced findings of who has access to paid family leave, why are certain groups experiencing lower rates of neglect over others, and things like that.
Which I think becomes really important when you consider, the work that's being done and the attention that is rightfully being paid to the reality that we have racial disproportionality in our child welfare system. And so to the extent that like this policy isn't penetrating all groups in the same way, racial, ethnic groups, I think that becomes really important in thinking about the child welfare population and how do we make sure that they are benefiting as much as possible from this policy. And so in my mind, one of the next steps around research really has to do with some individual level data. So all of this work, including the work that came out of the CDC, this is all being done at the state level, right? Aggregated state level statistics. But we don't even know what the uptake is in states that have paid family leave from the child welfare population, right? The families that are most at risk. Are they even using the policy? It doesn't give you 100% of your regular work income. So, even if you're just getting 60%, 90, maybe even 90%, can you afford that? We know families in the child welfare system tend to be very, very low income and poor. So I think really starting to look at the individual level, differences in outcomes for families that actually use paid family leave versus families that don't will be really important. And then I think, and it's funny for me to say this because I tend to be more of a quantitative researcher, but I think there's some qualitative work that really needs to be done here so that we can understand the meaning of paid family leave to families that are at risk of entering the child welfare system.
But I just want to understand what you're kind of describing there when you say following, you're proposing that like the next thing might be to actually follow human beings instead of a population policy.
Yes.
And when you say those that use and those that don't, you mean actually doing similar to like you guys did, comparing one state with it without it, right? Because like you wouldn't be able to follow, like they're not within like California, it wouldn't be possible to follow people who used paid family leave and then people who didn't when it was offered to them.
So I'm picturing a within state, or where the entire sort of universe of folks you're looking at are all in states that have paid family leave. So, you'd have to control very carefully for the things that determine who uses it and who doesn't. But I think really understanding how those decisions get made. There is research, for instance, to the point Jenny was making earlier, there is research that shows lower uptake by African-American families.
Within a state where they could use it.
Families too.
Okay. Yeah. And to treat me as the ignoramus I am compared to you guys on this, what would lead a person to, in a way I'm looking at it as like, that's leaving money on the table. If you have a job and you can leave it with pay and you're not, why is that happening?
Because if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're only being offered 60% of your wages, 60% of your wages versus not taking leave and retaining 100% of your wages might be
I see.
Kind of like question of survival for some families.
Okay, so I think I was misunderstanding like I was thinking of not using it as leaving but not using it. You're more describing people as not using it by staying in their job and an inopportune time for them. Okay.
Yeah. So when we think about bonding claims, we know that I say the statistic so much and now I'm blanking out on it. There is a large percentage of women who return to work within 2 weeks of giving birth, which is a wild reality when we think about the recovery, that just the physical recovery alone, let alone mental recovery, bonding, and like kind of adjusting to life with an infant. But because they can't afford an unpaid leave or a reduced pay leave, they return to work so quickly after the birth of a child. So when we think about any of these studies at the population level, these are great findings, but we do not know if any of the hypothetical families that we're thinking of, any of the children in the child welfare system or those investigations that we talked about, we don't know if their parents actually participated in paid family leave. So getting a better sense of how families at risk of child welfare involvement perceive, understand, utilize paid family leave, that qualitative piece that Sacha was talking about, I think is really important. There are a couple qualitative studies on paid family leave, particularly around California and Rhode Island. And some of the biggest critiques of paid family leave policies from participants and non-participants, so people who don't utilize it, is lack of wage replacement is one of the biggest complaints, is they're not receiving enough of their wages while on leave to either participate in the policy or make ends meet when they are on leave. And then there's a lot of administrative bureaucracy that is really complicated for families to know how to participate in these programs. And we know that that burden of navigating the social safety net can be very challenging for our at-risk families who are already trying to navigate a myriad of other supports and programs and all of that. So one more piece of red tape to walk through to access only 60% of their wages may not be feasible for a lot of child welfare involved families.
Especially if part of the sort of gauntlet you have to run through if you're a family trying to get your child back or keep your child who's got an open child welfare case involves showing stable housing, stable source of income, all those kinds of things that people are looking for, that the court's looking for before they send a kid back. And then the other piece is that we also know there's a high rate of unemployment amongst parents involved in the child welfare system. And so to have paid family leave.
Last question for you guys. I'm sure I'm not the first person that you guys have walked these findings through. And I know you talk to policymakers and people adjacent to them all the time. Do you, in your experience, with this research and with other stuff in the same vein that you've done, do you find that policymakers are receptive to, the message, the concept that like these social safety net investments that put money in the hands of families, having an ameliorative effect on child safety is a really compelling one for them, I guess, as compared to job retention or maternal health, right? Do they see that connection between safety net investments and kids are safer as like a compelling one to act?
It completely depends on which policymaker you're talking to. So, we all have our worldviews, right? And you're not going to change somebody's worldview with one research study. So I think the more that we're able to look at the various kinds of effects that a policy like paid family leave has, depending on, the particular issues that speak to people and fit within their general worldview, this particular finding may or may not be influential for them. But I do think there are a number of policymakers for whom this is a meaningful message. And nobody wants to see babies get hurt. Nobody, regardless of their political affiliations. So I think it is an important piece of information to get out there and to make sure it's part of the public discourse around paid family leave.
Well, and I think that worldview piece that you were just touching on, Sacha, is really important even beyond conversation with policymakers. For the last 5 years, I've been talking about this research with so many people that are not academics, not policymakers. And I usually get one of two responses. One being, that makes so much sense. Of course, we support parents, they can better support their kids. Or we can fly to the opposite end of the spectrum with the response of, well, what are they going to do with that extra money? And it's this mentality that we have about parents in the child welfare system, parents in poverty, and the worldview that many people hold about what certain people should be entitled to or deserving of. And if we can shift the thinking to kind of a family investment model of when we provide families, when we invest in families so that they have the resources they need, they need to meet their family's basic needs and provide care for their children. At the end of the day, that's what most parents are trying to do, right? But we have a villainized narrative around certain parents. And I think when someone is not as receptive to the message of paid family leave being an important policy to keep kids safe, it's not necessarily about paid family leave as much as it is about this more dominant narrative of what certain parents deserve to have, which is that broader safety net narrative too, right? So I think when we're exploring how we disseminate this research, who we talk to, it's really digging into this idea that more and more research is providing evidence that when families are supported, when parents have access to resources and financial resources, we are seeing compelling evidence that maltreatment rates are being blunted, again, to go back to that language that you used earlier. And that's powerful.
The report is called State Paid Family Leave Policies and Infant Maltreatment. I will include a link where you can read it if you would like to geek out and go through all the findings yourself in our show notes. Doctors Jenny Tanis and Sacha Klein, thank you guys for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks, John.
Thanks so much.
Thanks to Dr. Jenny Tanis of the Hope College School of Social Work and Dr. Sacha Klein of the Michigan State University School of Social Work for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.